what would you do if you looked around the sky and realized you were already dead? That is the question those two pilots faced in the exact second they understood the numbers. 2 biplanes, canvas wings, open cockpits, engines that rattled and screamed instead of roared, and surrounding them, tightening the circle like a noose, 22 enemy fighters built for speed, firepower, and modern aerial combat. Every manual, every instructor, every strategic rule of air warfare said the same thing. In moments like this, there is no escape, no maneuver, no heroic option. Just seconds before annihilation. In the early years of air combat, biplanes were already becoming relics. They were slow, lightly armed, and completely exposed against monoplane fighters with higher climb rates, heavier machine guns, and superior dive speed. They were considered flying targets. Museums, not battlefields, were where these aircraft belonged. And yet, on this day, 2 of them were still in the sky, still flying a mission that history itself had already declared obsolete. The pilots knew it. The enemy certainly knew it, and that is exactly why what happened next rewrote expectations. The enemy fighters did not rush in immediately. They circled. That was standard doctrine. Surround the prey. Force panic. Wait for fuel to drain and options to disappear. From above and behind, the sun at their backs. The attackers controlled the geometry of the fight. Altitude, speed, numbers, everything favored them. 22 against 2 was not combat. It was execution. Inside those biplanes, there was no illusion of fairness, no thought of victory. The pilots could see the silhouettes closing in, the glint of metal wings slicing through the sky. They could count them, one by one. The math was brutal and undeniable. Even if every bullet hit, even if luck intervened, there simply was not enough firepower to survive. This was the kind of situation pilots talked about later in bars, the kind that ended careers and lives in a few violent seconds. But something else was happening beneath that fear. Something quieter, something far more dangerous than panic. Clarity. When escape is impossible, hesitation becomes meaningless, and in that clarity, the rules that govern fear lose their power. These pilots were not thinking about doctrine anymore. They were not thinking about survival odds. They were thinking about angles, timing, and the one advantage no one expected them to use. Biplanes were slow, yes, but they could turn. They could bleed speed without stalling. They could hang in the air in ways modern fighters could not. What had made them obsolete in one era had given them a strange, almost forgotten edge in another. The enemy pilots circling above believed the fight was already over. That belief would become their first mistake. As the ring tightened, the sky grew crowded. Fighters overlapped paths. Pilots focused on positioning for the kill, not on coordination. Confidence crept in. And confidence is dangerous in combat. It narrows perception. It makes you predictable. The 2 biplanes did not flee. They did not dive. They did not scatter. They flew straight, steady, almost defiant, as if unaware of the death spiral forming around them. That illusion was deliberate, because in the next moments, the battle would stop being about numbers and start becoming about chaos, about forcing modern machines into situations they were never designed to handle, about turning certainty into confusion, and about using the very thing everyone laughed at those aircraft for to do something no one thought possible. Before the first shot was fired, before the first aircraft fell, the impossible had already begun. The outcome would not depend on firepower, but on psychology, on timing measured in heartbeats, on enemies who believed they were hunters, about to discover they had underestimated their prey. If this moment made you stop and rethink everything you thought you knew about air combat, this is exactly why understanding the full context matters. Stories like this are not just about planes or numbers. They are about decisions made under pressure that completely rewrote the rules. Take a second to drop a comment below and tell me what surprised you most so far, or even what you think those pilots did next. Your perspective matters here. And if this kind of deep, story-driven military history is something you want more of, make sure you hit the like button and check if you are subscribed. That small action helps this story reach people who would never hear it otherwise. To understand why this encounter was considered hopeless before it even began, you have to understand how air combat doctrine had evolved by the time those two biplanes found themselves surrounded. This was no longer the age of improvisation or gentleman duels in the sky. Air warfare had become mathematical, industrial, brutally efficient. Speed meant life, altitude meant control, firepower meant dominant, and by every measurable standard, biplanes had lost all three. Modern fighter aircraft were built around a simple principle: energy advantage. They climbed faster, dove harder, accelerated quicker, and disengaged at will. Pilots were trained to think in terms of geometry, not bravery. Whoever controlled altitude controlled the fight. Whoever controlled speed decided when combat began and when it ended. Against that logic, slow aircraft were liabilities, not assets. They could not run. They could not chase. They could only react. This is why biplanes were pushed out of frontline service. Canvas and struts belonged to a different era, one where dogfights were slow, visual, almost personal. In the modern sky, they were exposed. No armor. Minimal armament. Open cockpits that left pilots vulnerable to wind, debris, and gunfire. Facing even a handful of modern fighters was considered reckless. Facing 22 was considered suicidal. From the enemy perspective, the situation looked absurdly simple. Numerical superiority alone was overwhelming. But it wasn't just numbers. It was formation discipline, coordinated attack vectors. Pilots trained to exploit weaknesses systematically. The attackers knew how to rotate in and out of combat, conserving energy while maintaining pressure. They knew how to force slower aircraft into defensive turns until they stalled or presented their tail. This wasn't a hunt driven by emotion. It was procedure, and procedures create confidence. That confidence shaped every decision the attackers made as they circled higher and higher above the biplanes. They assumed time was on their side. They assumed fear would do half the work for them. In most cases, they would have been right. Slower aircraft usually tried to dive away, scattering, making themselves easier to isolate and destroy. Panic was predictable. Panic made pilots sloppy, and sloppy pilots died. But something about this situation didn't fit the pattern. The two biplanes didn't break formation. They didn't dive. They didn't climb disparate. They maintained spacing. Altitude steady. Course unchanged. Two trained eyes. That behavior was unsettling. It didn't look like resignation. It didn't look like panic. It looked deliberate. What the attackers failed to recognize was that doctrine works best against opponents who follow it. Air combat manuals are written, assuming the enemy behaves rationally, predictably, in ways that maximize survival. But when survival is already mathematically impossible, rational behavior changes, fear stops narrowing choices and starts expanding them. The enemy pilots were flying machines that demanded speed to stay safe. Tight turns bled energy. Low-speed maneuvers invited stalls. Prolonged turning fights were discouraged unless absolutely necessary. Their aircraft were optimized for slashing attacks, not sustained chaos. In contrast, the biplanes were built for stability at low speeds, for tightening radii, for control when airflow dropped. What had once been weaknesses were now dormant advantages, waiting for the right conditions. Those conditions were forming rapidly. The sky was crowded. 22 fighters meant overlapping flight paths, limited vertical separation, and rising risk of collision. Each pilot focused on positioning for the kill, trusting that others would cover blind spots. That trust would soon be tested, because when many hunters circle one prey, they begin to interfere with each other. And interference is where order collapses. At this stage, no shots had been fired, no aircraft damaged, yet the battle was already drifting away from certainty. The attackers believed they were compressing options. In reality, they were compressing space, and space is unforgiving in aerial combat. One unexpected movement, one violation of expectation, and the entire formation could unravel. The biplanes continued straight ahead, steady, almost indifferent to the threat above them. That calm wasn't courage. It was preparation, because the next move would not be about escaping the circle. It would be about breaking the logic that created it. What the attackers never truly considered was who they were dealing with inside those open cockpits. These were not desperate pilots clinging to outdated machines because they had no other option. These were men who understood their aircraft more intimately than most fighter pilots understood theirs. Biplane pilots lived closer to the air. They felt turbulence through the frame. They heard changes in airflow before instruments registered them. Every vibration carried information. Flying these machines demanded constant correction, constant awareness, and an instinctive relationship with lift and drag. That experience shaped their mindset. While modern fighter pilots were trained to trust engines, speed, and altitude, biplane pilots were trained to trust judgment. They had spent years operating in conditions where mistakes could not be corrected with power alone. Low speeds meant stalls were always close. Tight maneuvers meant constant risk. Survival depended on anticipating problems before they appeared. That habit was now about to pay dividends. The enemy pilots saw 2 obsolete aircraft and assumed the men inside them were equally obsolete. That assumption created distance, not just physically, but psychologically. It made the attackers careless in subtle ways. They stopped treating the biplanes as thinking adversaries and began treating them as objects, targets, problems already solved. That mental shift is dangerous in any form of combat because it blinds you to intent. Inside those biplanes, fear was present, but it was controlled. Panic did not dominate because panic requires uncertainty. And these pilots were very certain. They knew they could not outrun their enemies. They knew they could not climb above them. They knew diving would only delay the inevitable. That certainty removed false hope, and with it, hesitation. Their focus narrowed, not toward escape, but toward manipulation. They began studying the enemy's movement patterns. Which fighters were most aggressive, which held altitude, which maintained spacing, and which drifted too close to others. They watched how the circle tightened, how confidence turned into impatience. They noticed something crucial. The attackers were no longer coordinating with precision. They were jockeying for position, competing for the first kill. Small overlaps in flight paths became more frequent. Vertical separation decreased. The sky was getting crowded. This is where biplane pilots felt at home. Crowded airspace was familiar territory. Low altitude patrols, tight formations, close proximity flying. They were accustomed to operating where mistakes happened quickly and unforgivingly. Modern fighters preferred clean, open skies where speed could be exploited. That environment no longer existed. The attackers also misunderstood silence. The lack of defensive fire reinforced the belief that the biplanes were waiting to die. In reality, silence was information gathering. Every second without firing allowed the biplane pilots to map the three-dimensional geometry of the threat, to see which angles were closing fastest, to identify the weakest points in the ring. They were not passive. They were patient. Psychologically, something else was happening. The attackers were committed. Once you surround a target with overwhelming force, disengaging feels unnecessary, even cowardly. No one wanted to be the pilot who broke formation early. No one wanted to miss the moment of victory. That pressure locked them into the situation. The very dominance they felt became a trap. Meanwhile, the biplane pilots were mentally unburdened. They had already accepted the worst outcome. That acceptance freed them to take risks no rational opponent would expect. Risks that only made sense when survival was no longer the primary objective. And unpredictability is lethal in air combat. The enemy believed they controlled the fight because they controlled altitude and numbers, but they did not control behavior. And behavior determines outcomes when machines reach their limits. The attackers had forgotten that aerial combat is not just physics and firepower, it is perception, anticipation, and forcing the other side into decisions they are not prepared to make. The moment was approaching when one small deviation would collapse the illusion of control, when confidence would turn into confusion, when the ring would tighten too much and become unstable, and when two pilots flying machines everyone laughed at would stop reacting and start dictating the fight. If you were one of the attackers at this point, what mistake do you think you would make first? The moment the circle fully closed, the fight crossed an invisible line. What had been a controlled encirclement became something far more dangerous. Congestion. 22 fighters occupying the same slice of sky meant compressed altitude layers, intersecting turn paths, and shrinking margins for error. This was the phase where discipline mattered most, and it was exactly where discipline began to fail. From above, the attackers believed they were tightening pressure. In reality, they were tightening themselves into a problem. Each pilot wanted the cleanest angle, the fastest kill, the clearest shot. That desire pulled aircraft closer together. Wings overlapped, blind spots multiplied. Radio calls stacked on top of one another. Commands became suggestions. Timing drift. The two biplanes felt it immediately. The air around them changed, not physically, but behaviorally. Fighters began committing earlier than planned. One dipped slightly lower to line up a firing pass. Another cut inside a turn to avoid overshooting. Small corrections layered into chaos. The ring was no longer smooth. It was jagged. This was the math of aerial combat breaking down. Modern fighters relied on speed to stay safe. Their engines demanded forward motion. Tight turns bled energy quickly, and low energy meant vulnerability. Pilots were trained to avoid exactly what was happening now, but confidence overrides training faster than fear ever does. The attackers assumed they could recover at any moment. They believed they still owned the sky. Inside the biplanes, the pilots recognized the shift instantly. This was the window, not an opening, but a fracture. The attackers had compressed themselves into a space where reactions mattered more than horsepower, where milliseconds replaced meters, where one unexpected move could cascade through the formation. The biplanes adjusted subtly. No dramatic maneuver, no obvious break, just a slight reduction in speed, a barely perceptible change in spacing. It was enough to force the nearest fighters to react. One overshot, another tightened his turn to avoid collision. A third climbed instinctively, breaking vertical alignment. The geometry of the circle unraveled, and still no shots were fired. That restraint was intentional. Gunfire would announce intent. It would warn the attackers. Silence kept them guessing. Silence made them lean in closer. The biplanes wanted them close. Closer than doctrine allowed. Closer than safety margins could tolerate. One fighter finally committed. He rolled into a steeper dive than planned, confident that speed and firepower would end it quickly. That single decision forced reactions from the aircraft beside him, too adjusted to avoid crossing paths. Another pulled up sharply. In seconds, the attackers were no longer acting as a unit. They were reacting individually. This is where superiority fractures. The sky became crowded with intent, but empty of coordination. Every pilot now flew for himself. Every maneuver created consequences for someone else. The attackers still believed they were in control, but control had become an illusion maintained by momentum alone. The biplanes waited until that illusion was complete, because the next move would not be defensive. It would not be evasive. It would be offensive in a way no one expected, not through firepower, but through positioning, through forcing modern fighters into the one kind of fight they were never meant to win. And when that move happened, the circle would not just break, it would collapse inward. The decision was made without a word, spoken between the two pilots. It did not need to be discussed. It was instinct, built from years of flying aircraft that survived not by power, but by finesse. At the exact moment, the attackers lost cohesion. The biplanes did something no one above them anticipated. They slowed even more. Two modern fighter pilots slowing down in the middle of an encirclement was madness. Speed was safety. Speed was escape. Bleeding speed meant surrendering energy, and surrendering energy meant death. That belief was so deeply ingrained that it never occurred to them that slowing down could be used as a weapon. The biplanes eased into tight, coordinated turns, not away from the attackers, but into the space between them. Their turning radius was radically smaller. Where the fighters needed wide arcs to avoid stalling, the biplanes could pivot almost in place. Airflow stayed attached to their wings at speeds that would have dropped a modern fighter out of the sky. What looked like hesitation was actually control. The first fighter overshot completely. He blasted past the biplanes, guns blazing into empty air, forced to dive to recover speed. The second tried to tighten his turn to stay on target and felt the aircraft shudder. Warning signs buffeting, he pulled back instinctively, climbing just enough to avoid a stall. That climb broke his firing angle and put him directly in the path of another attacker above him. Suddenly, the sky was no longer 3 dimensions of freedom. It was a maze. The attackers had expected the biplanes to react to them. Instead, they were reacting to the bit. Each unexpected movement forced micro-decisions. Roll left or right, pull or push, climb or dive. Those decisions were being made at the edge of performance envelopes, where mistakes happened fast and consequences were immediate. One fighter clipped the wake turbulence of another and jolted violently. He broke off to regain control. Another pilot hesitated for a split second too long, afraid of colliding with his own side, and lost his attack window. That hesitation rippled outward. Attack runs were aborted. Lines of fire crossed. Pilots began prioritizing avoidance over aggression. This was the psychological shift the biplanes needed. They were no longer targets. They were obstacles. The enemy pilots had trained for clean attacks against fleeing or climbing opponents. They had not trained for enemies who invited them closer, who dragged them into slow, tight, disorganized airspace where visibility collapsed and reaction time shrank to nothing. The more fighters pressed in, the worse it became. Now the biplanes turned inward, tightening their own formation. They used each other as reference points, maintaining spacing with precision. Each turn was deliberate, predictable to the other, unpredictable to everyone else. To the attackers, it looked like the biplanes were spiraling into a trap of their own making. In reality, they were building a moving pivot point around which chaos formed, and then came the moment the attackers truly lost control. Two fighters converged on the same firing lane, each expecting the other to break off. Neither did. At the last second, one rolled hard, the other climbed sharply. Their paths missed by meters. Both lost their attack angles. Both lost speed. Both were now vulnerable, low energy, out of position. The biplanes passed beneath them untouched. No shots yet. Still silence. That silence was now terrifying. Pilots rely on sound as much as sight. Gunfire gives context. It defines threat, direction. The absence of it made the situation feel unreal. Were the biplanes armed? Were they stalling? Were they bait? No one knew. And not knowing forced hesitation. Confidence had evaporated. In its place was caution, and caution in a crowded sky is deadly. The attackers began widening their turns to regain spacing. That should have restored order. Instead, it opened gaps. Gaps the biplanes immediately exploited. They drifted toward the weakest edges of the circle, not to escape but to stretch it further. Every adjustment by the attackers created a new imbalance somewhere else. What had started as a simple encirclement had turned into a fragmented swarm of individuals flying conflicting solutions to the same problem. The biplanes were now controlling tempo. They decided when proximity happened. They decided when angles collapsed. They decided who overshot and who stalled. And the attackers were still thinking this was temporary. They believed one clean pass would end it. They believed firepower would fix everything. They were wrong. Because the next phase would not be about forcing mistakes. It would be about capitalizing on them. The first shot came not from desperation, but from opportunity. It happened so quietly, so precisely, that most of the attackers did not even realize the fight had crossed a new threshold. One of the biplanes rolled just enough to line up a fleeting angle on a fighter that had bled too much speed trying to stay inside the tightening chaos. It was not a clean pursuit. It was a snapshot, a fraction of a second where geometry aligned and training took over. The burst was short, controlled, and devastating. The fighter lurched violently smoke trailing from its engine as it dropped out of formation. That single moment shattered the last illusion holding the attackers together. Until then, they had believed the biplanes were playing some elaborate defensive game. Now they knew they were being hunted. The reaction was immediate and completely uncoordinated. Several fighters broke away at once, each pilot convinced he was the next target. Others surged forward aggressively, trying to end the fight before it slipped further out of control. Radio calls overlapped. Warnings collided with commands. Someone shouted about a damaged aircraft. Someone else demanded altitude separation. No one was listening anymore. The biplanes did not chase. That was the brilliance of it. Chasing would have restored the attackers' expectations. Instead, the biplanes returned to their tight, deliberate turns, forcing the enemy to make the next move. And the enemy did. A second fighter dove in too steeply, desperate to prove dominance. He came in fast, guns blazing, but speed was now his enemy. He overshot badly, streaking past the biplanes with no firing solution and nowhere to go. Pulling up would stall him. Rolling would put him into traffic. Diving meant surrendering position completely. In that hesitation, the second biplane fired. Another short burst, another aircraft wounded, another pilot forced out of the fight. Panic does not announce itself loudly. It spreads through subtle changes. Attack angles became conservative. Pilots hesitated before committing. Spacing widened unevenly. The circle that once felt suffocating now felt unstable, stretched thin in some areas and dangerously dense in others. The attackers were no longer thinking about how to win. They were thinking about how not to lose. That mental shift was fatal. Fighter pilots are trained to operate on momentum. Once momentum breaks, decision-making slows, and when decision-making slows in a dynamic environment, mistakes multiply. One pilot pulled up too aggressively and stalled momentarily. Another clipped disturbed air and had to recover. A third nearly collided with a wingman while trying to reposition. None of these errors would have been catastrophic alone. Together, they created openings everywhere. The biplanes moved like anchors in a storm, slow, controlled, predictable to each other, utterly confusing to everyone else. They used the attacker's own fear as leverage. Every time a fighter hesitated, it exposed someone else. Every time one pilot disengaged, he created space that destabilized another part of the formation. The attackers began to realize something terrifying. There was no safe way to press the attack anymore. Every approach risked collision, stall, or exposure. Every disengagement surrendered control. The fight had become a series of bad choices, and no one could see the least bad option clearly. Another fighter went down, not even from direct fire, but from loss of control during a frantic recovery maneuver. He entered a spin, trying to avoid an unexpected crossing path, and never recovered before impact. That loss echoed through the formation like a shockwave. This was no longer bad luck. This was something else entirely. The biplanes had turned numerical superiority into liability. More aircraft meant more interference, more confusion, more risk. The attackers were trapped by their own strength, and still the biplanes did not rush the moment. They allowed the pressure to build. They let uncertainty fester, because once fear takes hold in the air, it does not fade quickly. It compounds. It convinces pilots to second-guess instincts that once kept them alive. At this point, the impossible was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding in real time. The question was no longer whether the biplanes could survive. The question was how far this collapse would go. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but something far more unsettling. Hesitation spreading through experienced pilots who had never known it in combat. The attackers were no longer acting as a single force. They were individuals sharing the same airspace, each fighting a private battle against uncertainty. That is the moment when air combat becomes dangerous for everyone involved. The fighters still had the advantage on paper. Speed, altitude, firepower, numbers, but advantages only matter when pilots trust them. Now, every approach felt compromised. Every turn risked crossing another aircraft's path. Every dive carried the fear of overshooting into chaos. The sky, once a place of dominance, had become crowded, unpredictable, hostile. Some pilots tried to restore order. They widened their circles, climbed higher, attempted to re-establish vertical separation. That move should have reset the fight. Instead, it fractured it even further. The formation stretched unevenly, creating pockets where attackers were isolated and unsupported. Those pockets were invisible to anyone focused on survival rather than coordination. The biplanes recognized it immediately. They did not pursue the isolated fighters aggressively. They drifted toward them, calmly, methodically. The absence of urgency was unsettling. Fighters expect aggression when they are vulnerable. Aggression signals intent, signals control. That calm made pilots second-guess their instincts. Was this a trap? Was someone else lining up a shot? Was there another biplane they had not seen? Fear began to distort perception. Pilots fixated on the biplanes lost awareness of each other. Pilots watching their wingman lost awareness of the biplanes. Split attention created blind spots everywhere. One fighter rolled to keep the biplanes in sight and nearly collided with another crossing behind him. Another pulled vertical to escape perceived danger and found himself low on energy, forced to level out directly in front of someone else's guns. Radio discipline broke down completely. Calls overlapped. Warnings contradicted each other. Some pilots shouted to disengage. Others demanded an all-in attack to end the humiliation. There was no unified response because no one could agree on what was actually happening. This is where the psychological damage became irreversible. Fighter pilots rely on confidence as much as skill. Confidence allows decisive action. Decisive action keeps aircraft predictable to friendly pilots. When confidence erodes, everything slows down. Pilots hesitate. They double-check. They overcorrection in the air is lethal. Another attacker went down, this time from a rushed maneuver that put his aircraft into a shallow dive he could not recover from in time. The loss was visible. Everyone saw it. Everyone felt it. That sight did more damage than any burst of gunfire. It proved the situation was not just dangerous. It was unstable. Now pilots began thinking about survival over victory. Some peeled away, creating even larger gaps. Others stayed high, refusing to commit. A few remained aggressive, but aggression without coordination only worsened the disorder. The attackers were no longer controlling the fight. They were reacting to it. Meanwhile, the biplanes remained disciplined. Their movements stayed synchronized. Each turn complemented the other. They never crossed paths unnecessarily. They never chased too far. They never rushed. Their restraint made every attacker move feel excessive by comparison. At this stage, the imbalance was complete. The attackers still outnumbered the biplanes by a massive margin. But numbers had become irrelevant. What mattered now was coherence, and coherence was gone. The fight had transformed into something none of the attackers had trained for, a scenario where superior machines and superior numbers became liabilities rather than advantages. The biplanes had not destroyed the enemy formation through force. They had dismantled it through pressure. And now, with fear fully embedded and order shattered, the final phase was approaching, the moment when retreat would seem logical, necessary, and yet impossible to execute cleanly. The moment retreat entered the attackers' minds, the situation became truly dangerous. Disengagement in air combat is one of the most complex maneuvers a pilot can attempt, especially in crowded airspace. Turning away requires trust. Trust that others will cover you. Trust that no one will cut across your escape path. Trust that speed and altitude can be rebuilt without interference. In this fight, trust no longer existed. Some fighters began to peel off individually, trying to regain altitude and reset the engagement. Others hesitated, unsure whether retreat was a trap. That hesitation fractured timing. Aircraft moved in opposing directions. Vertical separation collapsed again. The sky became a web of conflicting escape routes. The biplanes did not pursue fleeing fighters directly. Instead, they positioned themselves where retreat paths overlapped. They did not block exits aggressively. They simply existed in the wrong place at the wrong time for the attackers. That presence forced last-second corrections. Last-second corrections caused stalls, overshoots, and near collisions. 1. Fighter tried to dive away to rebuild speed. Another, above him, chose the same escape vector seconds later. The higher aircraft dropped into disturbed air and jolted violently. The pilot reacted instinctively, pulling hard to recover. His aircraft shuddered, wing dropping altitude bleeding away. He'd barely regained control, but in doing so, crossed directly through another fighter SE firing line. Chaos fed on itself. Achi. These stage losses were no longer isolated events. They were consequences of interaction. Fighters were not being defeated one by one. They were being undone by the environment they had created. The presence of too many aircraft in too little space turned every movement into a risk multiplier. The psychological pressure intensified. Pilots who had entered the fight expecting a quick kill were now calculating fuel states, ammunition counts, and engine temperatures under stress. Cognitive load increased. Situational awareness dropped. Tunnel vision set in. Pilot stopped thinking globally and started thinking moment to moment. That is when mistakes accelerate. One attacker fixated on avoiding a biplane drifted directly into the path of another fighter diving from above. The collision was violent and immediate. Debris scattered through the air. Both aircraft were lost instantly. The shockwave of that collision rippled through the remaining attackers. It was undeniable proof that the fight had spiraled beyond control. The biplanes passed beneath the wreckage without altering course. That image broke something inside the attackers. The realization was no longer abstract. Staying in this fight meant risking death without even seeing the enemy fire. It meant losing control to circumstances rather than opponents. Pilots who had never aborted an engagement now considered it seriously. Retreat began in fragments, not a coordinated withdrawal, but a series of individual decisions. Some fighters dove away at maximum power. Others climbed sharply to clear airspace. A few lingered, unsure, unwilling to be the last ones left behind. That hesitation was costly. Every fragmenting movement created more exposure, more interference, more vulnerability. The attackers were no longer a force. They were traffic. The biplanes, still moving with deliberate calm, allowed the breakdown to continue. They did not need to press. Momentum was now working against the enemy. The situation no longer required bold action. It required patience. What started as an ambush had become a self-inflicted collapse. The attackers had lost aircraft, not because they were outgunned, but because they were outmaneuvered psychologically and spatially. The biplanes had transformed the fight into something the enemy could not solve with speed or firepower. And now, with the sky finally opening as fighters scattered in all directions, the impossible was no longer just happening. It was nearly complete. There was a moment, brief and almost quiet, when the sky finally began to empty. Not all at once, but unevenly, as fighters scattered in different directions, each pilot convinced that distance alone would restore safety. That was the final miscalculation, because distance only works when it is coordinated. Here, it was chaotic. Some attackers dove hard, pushing engines beyond recommended limits to escape the confusion. Others climbed steeply, trying to rebuild altitude and regain a sense of control. A few turned wide, cautious arcs, desperate to avoid crossing paths. Again, none of these movements were synchronized, and because of that, none of them restored dominance. The biplanes did not chase the fastest. They did not pursue the farthest. They drifted toward the slowest recoveries. The fighters who had lost energy, the ones climbing too steeply, bleeding speed, the ones turning too wide, exposing their rear arcs for just a moment too long. These were not dramatic attacks. They were inevitable. Another fighter was hit during a clumsy climb. Engine coughing as smoke streamed backward. He broke off, trailing damage, effectively removed from the fight. Another lost control briefly while trying to rejoin a wingman and was forced to dive away, abandoning the engagement entirely. Each of these exits thinned the attackers further, not through decisive blows, but through cumulative failure. At this point, the remaining pilots understood something unsettling. They were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to disengage without becoming the next loss. That mindset change sealed the outcome. Aggression vanished. Initiative disappeared. Every move became defensive. And defensive flying, when shared airspace is unstable, creates exposure rather than safety. The impossible was no longer improbable. It was unfolding methodically. The biplanes, still intact, still disciplined, were now dictating the end state of the engagement. They chose when to press and when to hold. They allowed attackers to flee far enough to stretch the formation beyond recovery. New regrouping, no counterattack, no second chance. The final fighters peeled away, engines straining, abandoning the airspace entirely. There was no pursuit, no victory roll, just two biplanes, continuing on their original course, the sky around them suddenly vast and empty. Where 22 enemies had once filled every direction, there was now nothing but open air and distant contrails. That silence was the true measure of what had happened. This encounter would not be remembered for kill counts or wreckage alone. It would be remembered because it violated the assumptions that governed air combat. It proved that superiority could collapse inward, that doctrine could fail under pressure, that machines designed for a different era could still dominate when the fight moved outside expected boundaries. The attackers returned with stories that sounded impossible. Outnumbered aircraft that refused to die. Pilots who seemed to control space rather than chase targets. A fight that made no sense according to the rules they had trusted their lives to. Those stories spread quietly, dismissed by some, believed by others, but never ignored. Because once the impossible happens, it reshapes expectations forever. And what followed would ensure that this was not just an anomaly, but a lesson that would echo long after the engines cooled. The aftermath of that encounter did not arrive with fanfare or official recognition. There were no dramatic announcements, no immediate changes in doctrine issued the next morning. Instead, the impact spread the way the most dangerous lessons always do in war, quietly, through conversations, through reports that did not quite add up, through pilots who came back shaken and struggled to explain what they had just experienced. On paper, the engagement made no sense. Numerical superiority had been overwhelming. Performance advantages were undeniable. And yet, two aircraft that should not have survived had not only escaped, but dismantled the logic of the ambush itself. Commanders reviewing the encounter focused on material outcomes, but pilots focused on something else entirely. Loss of control. Not mechanical failure, not bad luck. Loss of control over the fight. That distinction mattered. Pilots began talking differently about slow aircraft, about turning fights, about what happens when too many machines occupy the same airspace under pressure. The lesson was uncomfortable because it challenged the idea that progress always moves in one direction. Faster does not always mean safer. More firepower does not always mean dominance. And numbers, when poorly managed, can become a liability instead of an advantage. The biplanes did not win because they were superior machines. They won because they forced the fight into a domain where superiority stopped functioning. They dragged modern fighters into a problem those fighters were never designed to solve. Tight airspace, compressed reaction times, psychological overload. In that environment, experience and restraint outweighed horsepower. Over time, elements of this lesson quietly filtered into training. Emphasis on spacing, on disengagement discipline, on avoiding overconcentration around vulnerable targets, not because of two biplanes alone, but because they exposed a vulnerability that already existed. They did not invent chaos. They revealed it. What made the encounter endure was not just the impact of survival, but the inversion of expectation. The idea that the weakest participants dictated the outcome, that calm defeated aggression, that patience broke confidence. These are truths that apply far beyond air combat, which is why this story never truly faded. Even decades later, military analysts would return to moments like this when discussing asymmetric engagements, when teaching that dominance must be managed, not assumed, when reminding pilots that the enemy does not need to outperform you to defeat you. They only need to pull you into a fight you do not understand. Two biplanes, surrounded by 22 enemies, should have disappeared into history as a footnote. Instead, they became a quiet warning, a reminder that impossibility in war is often just untested assumption, and that sometimes the moment everyone agrees the outcome is inevitable is the moment the rules are about to break. If you stayed until the very end of this story, you already understand why moments like this matter. They are not just about aircraft or battles, but about how assumptions collapse under pressure. If this story changed the way you think about air combat or military history, take a second to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next one. Now leave a comment below and write this exact phrase: Control beats power. That comment tells me you watched to the end and helps this video reach people who care about real, high-level military history. And If you are still here, make sure you hit the like button and watch the next video appearing on your screen right now. It continues exploring moments where the impossible happened and history quietly changed forever.